They mocked him for hiring an Apache cook, but the laughter faded the moment they saw the child step down from the wagon. Caleb Whitmore had lived alone on his ranch for 7 long years, 40 miles of open prairie in every direction, nothing but wind, cattle, and the slow creak of his barn door at dusk. He hadn't hired Alara Redbird out of kindness. He needed help before winter came, someone to keep the stove warm and the book straight while he rode fence lines that stretched nearly 2 miles from end to end. When she arrived, the sky was the color of copper dust, and the whole town seemed to gather just to watch. Alara climbed down without asking for a hand, proud, quiet, a wool blanket wrapped around a small boy who couldn't have been more than 4. The boy held a silver pendant that caught the sunlight like a signal mirror. Caleb noticed it before he noticed anything else. The town noticed the boy. "You didn't say she had baggage," one man muttered. Caleb didn't answer. He rarely did. The prairie wind carried the scent of dry grass and horse sweat as he led them toward the ranch house, boots crunching over gravel that hadn't known company in years. That night, the child's soft footsteps echoed across the wooden floorboards, small and careful, like he was measuring a place he'd never seen but somehow recognized. Caleb sat at his kitchen table, oil lamp burning low, listening to the rhythm of that sound. He told himself it was nothing. A hired cook and her son. That was all. But when the boy stepped into the light, Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. The child's eyes were blue. Not gray. Not hazel. Blue. The same clear shade that stared back at Caleb every morning in the tin mirror above his wash basin. He had seen blue eyes on the prairie before, but not set in a face framed by copper skin and dark hair. Alara caught him looking. She didn't flinch. She didn't explain. She only said, "He keeps the pendant close." It was a gift. Caleb's gaze dropped to the silver piece again. He knew that shape. He knew the faint scratch near the edge, a mark made by a careless knife on a long-ago night when the wind howled and the world felt smaller than a campfire circle. 5 men rode up the next afternoon, horses stopping in a line 30 feet from his porch. Their shadows stretched long across the yard. "You bringing trouble out here, Whitmore?" one of them called. Caleb stepped forward, hat low over his brow. Behind him, the boy stood still, studying the riders without fear. The prairie went quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a man hear his own heartbeat. And that's when Caleb realized something colder than the winter wind moving in from the north. The past doesn't knock. It rides straight back into your yard, wearing your eyes, holding a silver pendant you thought you'd left behind 5 years ago. The 5 riders did not dismount, but they did not leave either, and that was enough to turn the air heavy as July before a thunderstorm. Caleb Whitmore stood on his porch with his hands resting easy at his sides, not reaching for anything, not offering anything either. The wind pushed dust across the yard in thin spirals, brushing against the porch steps and the boy's small boots. Alara Redbird remained near the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame, the other steady on the child's shoulder. She did not hide behind Caleb. She did not step forward. She simply watched. The man at the front of the riders cleared his throat. "Town is uneasy," he said. "People are talking." Caleb gave a small nod. People always do. A few of the men shifted in their saddles, leather creaking, horses flicking their tails against flies. "They say the boy is not from around here," another voice added. The boy lifted his chin, blue eyes bright in the afternoon sun, and Caleb felt that tightening again, the same pull in his chest that had not left since the night before. He remembered another evening 5 years back, a campfire low and steady, the sound of wind sliding across open grass, and a promise he had not known he was making. He had ridden out before dawn then, chasing work, chasing distance, believing that distance solved everything. Now that same distance felt like a mistake measured in miles. The silver pendant glinted again as the boy shifted, and Caleb saw the faint mark along its edge, a shallow line carved absent-mindedly by his own knife. He had given it away on a night when he thought he was only offering protection for the road ahead. He had not considered what else might travel with that protection. "You planning to keep them here?" the lead rider asked. Caleb looked back at Alara. Her expression did not plead. It did not accuse. It held something steadier than either of those. It held patience. "They have work," Caleb answered at last. "And I have need." The riders exchanged glances. One of them gave a short laugh that carried no humor. "Need can cost you." Caleb stepped down from the porch, boots landing firm in the dirt, closing the distance by 10 quiet feet. "So can fear," he said. Silence settled over the yard, thick and unmoving. The prairie stretched behind him for miles, open and honest. He had built this ranch with his own hands, board by board, fence post by fence post, and he was not about to measure his decisions by the whispers of men who went home to full tables and crowded rooms. The boy took a cautious step forward then, leaving the shadow of the doorway. He did not cling to Alara. He did not retreat. He simply stood beside Caleb, small shoulder brushing against worn denim. The riders noticed. Everyone noticed. The resemblance was no longer something you had to search for. It was there in the angle of the jaw, the quiet way he held his ground, the steady look that did not drop under scrutiny. The wind lifted again, carrying the scent of hay and distant rain. One by one, the riders adjusted their reins. The lead man tipped his hat, slow and uncertain. "Town will be watching," he warned. Caleb nodded once. "Let them." When the horses finally turned and rode back toward the road, the yard felt wider than before, but not lighter. Caleb remained still until the dust settled, then looked down at the boy. Up close, there was no denying it now. The past had not only returned. It was standing at his side, breathing the same air, waiting for him to decide what kind of man he intended to be. That evening the prairie held its breath as if it too were waiting for Caleb Whitmore to make peace with what stood beside him. The sun dipped low, turning the grass into waves of bronze, and the ranch settled into its familiar sounds, cattle shifting in the distance, the barn door tapping once in the wind, the quiet crackle from the kitchen stove where Alara Redbird moved with steady hands. Caleb remained outside longer than usual, resting his forearms on the top rail of the fence, staring across the 2 miles of land he had claimed as his own. For years he had believed solitude was strength. Now solitude felt like a question. The boy wandered toward the corral, careful but curious, small boots leaving faint prints in the dust. Caleb watched him test the latch the way he himself had done as a child, thoughtful, patient, never forcing what could be understood. The resemblance was no longer a passing thought. It was a fact standing under an open sky. When the boy reached up to touch the mane of the old bay mare, he did it with the same quiet confidence Caleb had learned from his own father, a man who spoke little but meant every word. "She is gentle," the boy said, voice soft but certain. Caleb stepped closer. "Her name is Mercy," he replied. The boy smiled at that, as if the word carried more meaning than either of them had expected. Inside the house, Alara set 3 plates instead of 2. The simple act shifted something in the room. Caleb noticed the way she moved, not like a guest, not like someone asking permission, but like someone who understood the rhythm of a home even if she had not yet been invited to claim it. The silver pendant rested against the boy's shirt as he climbed into the chair across from Caleb, blue eyes steady, searching without accusation. Caleb cleared his throat. "What is his name?" he asked. "Samuel," Alara answered. "My father called him Sam." The word father lingered in the air between them, neither heavy nor light, just present. Caleb looked at the child again. "Sam," he repeated, testing how it felt. The boy's lips curved slightly, as if hearing something familiar in that tone. After supper, as dusk settled in and the first stars appeared, Caleb stepped onto the porch once more. Alara joined him, leaving the boy inside tracing patterns on the wooden table with one small finger. The wind lifted her dark hair and carried the scent of distant rain. "You never came back," she said quietly, not as a wound, but as a truth. Caleb nodded. "I thought leaving was easier than staying." Alara studied the horizon. "It usually is." Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was full of miles traveled and choices made. Inside, Sam pressed his face to the window, watching the 2 figures on the porch as if he already understood that the space between them was narrowing. Caleb felt it too, that narrowing, that quiet pull towards something he had never planned for. The prairie did not change. The land did not shift. But in that fading light, Caleb Whitmore understood that his ranch was no longer measured in acres alone. It was measured in the small hand that had reached for Mercy's mane, in the blue eyes that reflected his own, and in the woman beside him who had waited without demanding, trusting that one day he would finally stop riding away. Morning came slow and pale, stretching light across the prairie like a quiet promise, and Caleb Whitmore was already awake before the sun cleared the horizon. He stood at the wash basin, staring into the small tin mirror, studying the familiar lines of his own face as if they might shift under scrutiny. Outside, he could hear Samuel's laughter drifting across the yard, light and unguarded, mixing with the low rumble of cattle beyond the fence. It had been years since that sound had lived on this land. Caleb stepped onto the porch and found the boy near the corral again, one hand resting on Mercy's neck, speaking softly as if the horse understood every word. "She listens," Samuel said when he noticed Caleb watching. Caleb leaned against the post. "She does that for folks who are honest." The boy nodded as though that explained everything. Alara moved between the house and the clothesline, sleeves rolled neatly, her presence steady as the wind that carried the scent of sage across the open field. She did not ask what Caleb had decided overnight. She simply went about her work as if time itself would answer in due course. By mid-morning, a wagon appeared on the distant road, wheels creaking over dry earth, and Caleb felt the weight return to his shoulders. Two townsmen climbed down when they reached the gate, hats held stiffly in their hands. They did not step fully into the yard. "We need to talk," one of them said, eyes flicking towards Samuel, then away again. Caleb opened the gate himself. "Then talk." The men exchanged glances before speaking. Some folks think this arrangement is temporary. The word temporary hung in the air like dust. Caleb folded his arms, not in defense, but in certainty. "It is not." Silence followed, broken only by the soft scrape of Samuel's boots against the dirt as he traced the fence line with careful steps, counting posts under his breath. Alara stood behind him, neither hidden nor exposed, simply present. The taller of the two men cleared his throat. "The boy. He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to." Caleb stepped forward until the distance between them closed to a few steady feet. "He looks like he belongs," Caleb said quietly. The men studied him, searching for hesitation, for doubt. They found neither. After a long moment, they nodded once, uncertain but unwilling to press further. When they drove away, the yard felt different than it had the day before. Not lighter, stronger. Samuel approached Caleb then, holding the silver pendant in his small palm. "Mother says this was given with a promise," he said. Caleb knelt, so they were eye level, dust settling around his boots. "It was," he answered. The boy tilted his head. "Promises are meant to be kept." Caleb let out a slow breath, one that carried 5 years of distance and the weight of a choice finally claimed. He placed his hand gently over the pendant, then over the boy's small fingers. "Yes," he said, voice steady as the prairie itself. "They are." And as the wind moved across the open land, carrying the sound of cattle and the faint hum of a ranch no longer empty, Caleb understood that the miles he once rode to escape had led him back to the only place he was ever meant to stand. The change did not happen all at once. It came the way morning comes to the prairie, slow, steady, almost unnoticed until the light is everywhere. 3 days passed without riders at the gate. 3 days of Samuel trailing Caleb across the yard, asking quiet questions about fence posts and cattle brands, about why the wind always seemed stronger after noon. Caleb answered each one without hurry. He showed the boy how to test a board for rot, how to listen for a loose hinge, how to stand still long enough for a nervous horse to trust you. Alara watched from the porch sometimes, a tin cup warming her hands, her expression unreadable but calm. She did not interrupt. She did not correct. She allowed space for something to grow. On the 4th morning, Caleb found a small pair of boots already waiting by the barn before he stepped outside. Samuel stood there, hat slightly too large for his head, the silver pendant resting against his shirt. "I want to help mend the north fence," the boy said, voice steady. Caleb studied him for a moment, measuring more than height. The north fence ran nearly a mile, stretching toward open grassland where the wind had a mind of its own. "It is a long walk," Caleb replied. Samuel nodded once. "I can walk." They set out together, boots pressing twin paths into the dust. Along the way, Caleb spoke of things his own father had once told him. That land does not belong to a man unless he is willing to care for it. That a promise is not proven in words, but in repetition, day after day. Samuel listened the way children do when they sense something important is being handed to them. When they reached the fence, Caleb handed the boy a small hammer, light enough for steady hands. Samuel worked carefully, tapping each nail with focus that made Caleb's chest tighten in a way that no loneliness ever had. Around midday, a wagon rolled slowly along the distant road again. This time it did not stop at the gate. It slowed, lingered, then moved on. Caleb noticed. So did Alara, who had stepped outside with a folded quilt over her arm. She looked at Caleb across the open stretch of land, and for the first time there was something softer in her eyes. Not uncertainty, recognition. That evening, as the sky turned lavender and gold, Samuel placed the hammer back in Caleb's hand without being told. "Did I do it right?" he asked. Caleb looked at the straight line of posts standing firm against the wind. "You did," he answered. The boy smiled, small but certain. Inside the house, 3 plates were set again, not as an adjustment, but as a habit. Caleb took his seat without hesitation. He did not speak of the town. He did not speak of the past. Instead, he reached across the table and adjusted the silver pendant gently so it would not slip into Samuel's bowl. It was a small gesture, a quiet one, but outside, the prairie wind carried it just the same. And somewhere beyond the fence line, men who once doubted began to understand that some things do not ask permission to belong. They simply stand their ground until the world accepts what was true all along. By the end of the week, the ranch no longer sounded hollow. The wind still moved across the prairie in long, steady breaths, but now it carried laughter with it, the small, bright kind that belongs to a child who has begun to feel certain of where he stands. Caleb Whitmore noticed the change in the smallest details. A second tin cup resting beside the well, a smaller pair of gloves drying on the fence rail, footprints that crossed his own in the dust instead of trailing behind. Samuel had started rising before sunrise, waiting on the porch steps with that oversized hat pulled low, watching the eastern sky turn from gray to pale gold. "Is this when the cattle wake up?" he asked one morning as Caleb stepped outside, rolling his shoulders against the cool air. "They wake when the light tells them to," Caleb answered. "Same as most of us." The boy nodded as if that explained something larger than cattle. Together they walked the southern pasture, nearly 3/4 of a mile of open grass, where dew clung to their boots. Caleb showed him how to read the land, how to notice where water had pooled after rain, how to follow the bend of the fence line by sight alone. Samuel listened without distraction, absorbing each word like a seed pressed into soil. Back at the house, Alara moved through her morning chores with quiet confidence. She had begun humming while she worked, a low melody that blended with the creak of floorboards and the faint whistle of the kettle. Caleb found himself pausing at the doorway more often, listening, aware that the sound settled into the walls as if it had always belonged there. Late one afternoon, a wagon from town rolled past again, slower than before. This time it stopped near the gate. The driver stepped down, not with suspicion, but with something closer to curiosity. He lifted a small parcel from the seat and carried it forward. "For the boy," he said, placing it in Caleb's hands. Inside was a slim book, edges worn, pages filled with simple lessons. Caleb glanced toward the road. No crowd had gathered. No riders waited in line. Just one man tipping his hat before climbing back onto his wagon. Samuel opened the book that evening by lamplight, tracing letters with careful fingers. "Will you teach me?" he asked softly. Caleb pulled his chair closer. "I will." The prairie night wrapped around the house, wide and endless, but the lamplight held steady inside, casting 3 shadows against the wall instead of one. Alara watched them from across the table, her eyes reflecting the glow. She did not speak of the miles she had traveled to reach this porch. She did not speak of the years she had waited. She only reached forward once, adjusting the pendant so it rested safely against Samuel's chest. Caleb noticed the gesture. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, not dramatic, not uncertain, simply firm. Outside, the wind moved across 2 miles of land that had once felt empty. Now it carried the quiet truth of something claimed not by force, but by staying. And in that stillness, Caleb understood that belonging was not granted by a town or confirmed by blood alone. It was proven each morning you chose not to walk away. Autumn edged its way across the prairie without asking permission, painting the grass in faded gold and cooling the mornings enough that breath showed in thin white clouds. Caleb Whitmore noticed Samuel had grown taller in small, stubborn inches, the oversized hat no longer slipping over his eyes. The boy walked with a steadier stride now, measuring his steps beside Caleb's as if learning a rhythm rather than chasing one. The ranch had settled into a pattern that felt less like arrangement and more like truth. At sunrise they checked the cattle along the western ridge, nearly a mile and a half of open land where the wind rolled unhindered. Samuel carried a coil of rope across his shoulder, proud of its weight, and Caleb did not take it from him. "You do not have to prove anything every day," Caleb said once, watching the boy strain slightly against the breeze. Samuel shook his head. "I am not proving. I am staying." The words were simple, but they landed deep. Back at the house, Alara prepared for the coming cold, stacking split wood beneath the eaves, stitching a thicker lining into Samuel's coat by lamplight. She moved with quiet assurance, her presence no longer tentative, no longer measured. The town had grown quieter in its doubts. A few men had begun tipping their hats when they passed. The general store owner sent flour without being asked. No one spoke openly of resemblance anymore. It had become understood. One afternoon a group of riders approached again, not in challenge, but in number, 5 this time, dust rising behind them in soft trails. Caleb met them at the gate with Samuel standing beside him, shoulder nearly brushing his hip. The riders removed their hats. "We are hosting a harvest supper in town," the lead man said. "All families are welcome." The word families lingered in the air, deliberate and careful. Caleb looked down at Samuel, then toward Alara who had stepped onto the porch, hands resting loosely at her sides. He felt no surge of pride, no need to answer loudly. He simply nodded once. "We will come." That evening, as the sky deepened into violet and the first chill settled over the land, Caleb stood alone for a moment near the north fence where the posts now held firm against the wind. He ran his hand along the wood Samuel had helped mend weeks before. It had not loosened. It had not bowed. Behind him, he heard footsteps, lighter than his own, but certain. Samuel stopped beside him and looked out across the open acres that once felt endless and empty. "This is ours," the boy said quietly. Caleb did not correct him. He did not explain deeds or measurements or the way the law might define ownership. Instead, he rested his hand on the boy's shoulder and let the silence stretch, wide and honest as the prairie itself. In the fading light, Alara's figure appeared at the porch doorway, steady and unafraid, framed by the glow from inside. Caleb realized then that the ranch was no longer defined by miles of fence or acres of grazing land. It was defined by who remained when the wind rose and who stood beside him when the dust settled. And as the first stars flickered awake above the western ridge, Caleb understood that staying had never been about land at all. It had been about choosing, every single day, not to ride away. The harvest supper came with lantern light and the smell of fresh bread drifting across Main Street. And for the first time in years Caleb Whitmore rode into town without feeling like a man passing through. Samuel sat in front of him on the saddle, small hands wrapped around the horn, hat steady now, no longer borrowed but earned. Alara rode beside them on Mercy, her posture straight, her gaze calm as the sun slipped behind the grain elevator and painted the sky in copper and rose. The town had gathered outside the church hall, long wooden tables stretching nearly 30 feet end to end, covered with simple cloth and tin plates that caught the glow of hanging lamps. Conversations quieted when the 3 of them dismounted. Not out of suspicion this time. Out of attention. Caleb helped Samuel down first. The boy landed firm on his boots and looked around with open curiosity, not shrinking, not hiding. A few children his age stood near the steps, whispering to one another. One of them stepped forward and nodded at Samuel's pendant. "That is shiny," the boy said. Samuel touched it lightly. It was given with a promise. The child seemed to accept that answer without question. Caleb noticed the exchange and felt something settle deep inside him. The mayor approached, older now than Caleb remembered, spectacles resting low on his nose. "We are glad you came," he said simply. No long speeches. No forced smiles. Just that. Caleb inclined his head. "We are glad to be here." The word we carried weight. They took their seats near the middle of the long table. Not at the edge. Not set apart. Food passed from hand to hand, bowls of stew, plates of corn, slices of pie cut carefully and shared without counting portions. Samuel listened as men spoke about weather patterns and crop yields, absorbing the cadence of town life the way he had learned the rhythm of fence posts. Alara answered a woman's question about winter herbs with quiet assurance. explaining which roots kept a cough at bay and which leaves brought down a fever. Heads nodded. Notes were taken. No one interrupted her. Caleb watched all of it without announcing his approval. He did not need to. When the lanterns burned lower and a fiddle began to play. Near the church steps, a few couples moved slowly across the packed dirt, boots scuffing in time. Samuel tugged lightly at Caleb's sleeve. "Is this where we belong?" he asked, voice barely rising above the music. Caleb looked around at the long tables, the shared bread, the faces that no longer held doubt. He thought of the north fence standing firm against the wind, of mornings measured in shared footsteps, of the simple truth that had taken root without asking permission. He rested his hand on Samuel's shoulder and answered in a tone steady as the land he had once tried to outrun. "This is one of the places," he said. Samuel nodded, satisfied with that. Above them, the prairie sky stretched wide and open, the same sky that had watched Caleb ride away years before. Tonight it watched him remain seated, his family beside him. No horse pointed toward the horizon. And in the quiet glow of lantern light, the town began to understand that some stories do not end with a man leaving. They begin the day he decides to stay. The night after the harvest supper, the prairie felt different, as if the wind itself had softened its edge. Caleb Whitmore rode home with Samuel asleep against his chest, the boy's hat tilted back and the silver pendant resting warm under his chin. Alara rode close, her silhouette steady against the moonlit horizon. The ranch lights came into view from nearly half a mile out, small but certain, like a promise that did not flicker. Caleb eased Samuel down gently once they reached the porch, carrying him inside without waking him. The house held the faint scent of wood smoke and fresh bread, and for a moment Caleb stood in the center of the room, listening to the quiet breathing of a home no longer empty. In the days that followed, the shift became clearer. Town children began stopping by the ranch in the afternoons, first one, then three, then five at a time, bringing small offerings of apples or folded notes from their mothers. Samuel showed them the north fence he had helped mend, walking its length proudly, nearly a mile of straight line against open grass. Caleb watched from a distance, leaning on the gate, saying little. He did not need to explain what had changed. The land had witnessed it already. One morning the mayor arrived alone, without wagon or announcement. He removed his hat and stood near the porch steps. "We are drawing up new records for the township," he said carefully. "Families are being listed properly this year." Caleb met his gaze, steady and calm. "Then list us properly." There was no tremor in his voice, no hesitation. The mayor nodded once, as if something long unsettled had finally found its place. Alara stood just inside the doorway, sunlight catching in her dark hair, her expression neither triumphant nor wary, simply certain. Later that afternoon, as clouds rolled in from the west and the air hinted at early frost, Samuel approached Caleb with the small book from town tucked under his arm. "Will you show me how to write our name?" he asked. Caleb knelt on the porch boards, drawing a slow line in the dust with his finger. He spelled it carefully, each letter deliberate, each stroke firm. Samuel copied it beside him, smaller but determined. When he finished, he looked up, blue eyes reflecting the sky above them. "It looks right," he said. Caleb felt a quiet weight lift from somewhere deep inside him. Not because the town had accepted them, not because papers would now carry their names together, but because the boy had written it without doubt. As the first frost finally settled over the prairie and the wind carried winter's promise across 2 miles of open land, Caleb understood that belonging had never been granted by approval alone. It had been built, step by step, nail by nail, word by word. And as Samuel traced their shared name once more in the dust, Caleb Whitmore realized that some legacies are not inherited. They are chosen, then protected, by simply standing your ground and calling it home. Winter settled across the prairie in a wide white hush, covering 2 miles of open land in frost that shimmered beneath the early sun. Caleb Whitmore rose before dawn as he always had, but now there were 2 sets of boots waiting by the door. Samuel stood wrapped in a thicker coat Alara had sewn, breath rising in small clouds as he pushed the door open with determined hands. "Does the fence sleep in winter?" he asked quietly. Caleb allowed himself a faint smile. "No," he said. "It holds." They walked the north line together, the boards pale with frost, each post steady against the wind that came down from the high ridge. The ranch did not shrink in winter. It revealed itself. Every weakness showed. Every strength endured. Caleb watched Samuel press his gloved palm against the wood he had once helped mend. The nail heads had not shifted. The line remained straight. That mattered more than words. Back at the house, Alara tended the stove, adding wood with calm precision. The room glowed warm against the cold outside, lamplight touching the walls that had once echoed with emptiness. Now they carried the quiet hum of shared mornings, the scratch of pencil against paper as Samuel practiced the family name beneath Caleb's patient eye. The letters grew firmer each day. No hesitation in the curve of the W. No uncertainty in the final stroke. One afternoon, as snow began to fall in thin silver threads, a familiar wagon approached slowly along the road. It stopped at the gate, and the mayor stepped down once more, holding a folded document protected carefully beneath his coat. He did not linger at the threshold. He walked straight to the porch and handed it to Caleb without ceremony. "The records are complete," he said. Caleb unfolded the paper, scanning the inked lines. 3 names stood together in steady script. Not separated, not questioned, simply written. He looked up at the mayor and nodded once. No speech was necessary. When the wagon rolled away, Samuel tugged gently at his sleeve. "Is that us?" he asked. Caleb knelt, so their eyes met at the same level. "It is," he answered. The boy studied the page, then the land beyond the fence, then the house behind him. "Then I will take care of it," he said with quiet conviction. Caleb felt something shift inside him, something deeper than pride. It was recognition that this ranch, these 2 miles of open prairie, this steady roof and warm stove, would one day stand in the boy's memory as proof that staying was stronger than running. As evening settled and snow softened the edges of the world, Caleb stepped onto the porch alone for a moment. The wind moved gently now, no longer sharp, carrying the faint sound of Samuel's laughter from inside. He looked out across the fence line disappearing into white and understood that the land had not changed him. The choice had. He had once believed freedom meant riding toward the horizon without looking back. Now he knew freedom was the courage to remain when the past caught up to you and called you by name. Behind him, the door opened softly. Alara stood there, her presence steady as the stove's glow. Caleb reached for her hand without hesitation. The prairie stretched wide and endless before them, but he did not feel the pull to follow it. He had already arrived, and in the quiet of that winter night, with his family inside and his name written where it belonged, Caleb Whitmore understood that some men find their legacy in distance. Others find it by standing still and choosing to stay. Spring did not rush the prairie. It arrived in quiet signs, in thawed earth beneath the fence posts, and in the low steady call of cattle across the ridge. Caleb Whitmore noticed the change first in the sound of the wind. It no longer cut through the boards of the house. It moved around them, as if respecting what stood inside. Samuel had grown used to rising before the sun, but now he stepped outside without shivering, scanning the horizon the way Caleb once had, measuring the day before it began. "The grass is coming back," he said one morning, pointing toward a patch of green nearly half a mile from the barn. Caleb followed his gaze and nodded. "Land remembers how to start again," he replied. Samuel seemed to hold on to that sentence longer than the others. They spent the morning repairing a section of the western fence where melting frost had loosened the soil. Samuel carried the smaller tools, steady hands no longer uncertain. When he hammered a nail flush against the board, he did not look up for approval. He simply moved to the next one. Alara stood near the clothesline, fresh air catching the edges of her dress as she watched the 2 figures against the wide field. She had begun planting a small garden behind the house, turning soil with patient strokes, pressing seeds into ground that had once felt foreign but now felt claimed. The town wagon passed more often these days, sometimes stopping, sometimes only slowing. News traveled both ways. A shipment of lumber arrived unasked, paid for in part by neighbors who had quietly decided the ranch would stand longer if supported rather than doubted. Caleb accepted the boards without speech. Gratitude did not need announcement. One afternoon Samuel approached with the slim book tucked beneath his arm and the folded township record in his other hand. "Read it to me again," he said. Caleb sat on the porch steps, the wood warm beneath him, and unfolded the paper carefully. He read each name slowly, clearly, the way he had on that winter day. Samuel listened with a stillness that spoke of understanding rather than curiosity. When Caleb finished, the boy traced the inked letters with one finger. "It will stay like this?" he asked. Caleb looked out over the 2 miles of pasture stretching toward the open sky. "As long as we do," he answered. The statement did not carry threat or warning. It carried choice. That evening, as the sun lowered and the sky turned soft gold, Samuel stood beside the north fence again, the first one he had helped mend. He ran his hand along the smooth line of wood and then looked back at Caleb. "You did not ride away," he said quietly. Caleb met his eyes, blue reflecting blue beneath the wide horizon. "No," he said, "I did not." In that simple exchange lay years of distance bridged, promises kept, and a past that had returned not to haunt, but to root itself. The prairie stretched endless and open as it always had, but it no longer called Caleb forward. It stood behind him now, like a witness. And as spring settled fully into the land, Caleb Whitmore understood that legacy was not written in miles traveled or trails left behind. It was written in fences that held, in names spoken without hesitation, and in the steady choice to remain when staying mattered most. Summer returned with a warmth that settled deep into the boards of the house and the soil beneath the fence posts, and the prairie stretched green and wide as if it had never known frost. Caleb Whitmore stood at the edge of the western pasture one late afternoon, watching Samuel guide a small group of calves toward the shade of the cottonwoods nearly a mile from the barn. The boy moved with steady patience, not rushing, not shouting, simply walking the line the way he had been shown. The silver pendant rested against his chest, no longer just a symbol of promise, but a quiet reminder of where that promise had led. Alara worked near the garden rows behind the house, her hands moving through the earth with the same certainty she carried in her gaze. The town had grown accustomed to the sight of the three of them riding in together on market days, no longer an arrangement to be discussed, but a family to be greeted. Caleb felt the change not in loud declarations, but in simple gestures. A neighbor leaning over the fence to offer advice about a stubborn mule. A woman from town bringing preserves wrapped in cloth without hesitation. The ranch had become part of the map in more ways than one. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the 2 miles of pasture in gold, Samuel approached Caleb with a folded sheet of paper in his hand. "I wrote it myself," he said, holding it out carefully. Caleb unfolded the page and read the uneven letters shaped with effort and pride. It was not long, just a few lines about the ranch, about the fence that held against the wind, about Mercy the horse and the way the grass turned bright after rain. At the bottom, written with deliberate strokes, was their family name. Caleb looked up, his expression quiet but full. "You wrote this without my help," he said. Samuel nodded. "I know how it goes now." The words carried more than learning. They carried belonging. Caleb rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the strength there that had grown season by season. He thought of the night the past had returned to his porch without warning, of the uncertainty that had followed, of the choice that had seemed simple but felt heavy. Now, standing under a sky that stretched endless and open, he understood that the weight had never been a burden. It had been a chance. Alara stepped closer, her presence as steady as ever, and looked out across the land with them. No one spoke for a long moment. The prairie wind moved softly through the grass, carrying the scent of summer and distant rain. Caleb realized that nothing dramatic had marked the turning point. No single day had declared the ranch changed. It had shifted slowly, in quiet acts repeated again and again. And as Samuel folded his paper carefully and tucked it against his chest, Caleb Whitmore knew that legacy was not found in grand gestures or loud claims. It was found in mornings shared, in fences repaired, in names written with confidence, and in the simple courage to remain when the horizon called you away. The prairie stretched wide before them, but for the first time in his life, Caleb felt no urge to follow it. He had already found what he had been riding toward all along. Years later, the prairie would still stretch the same 2 miles beyond the north fence, and the wind would still move across it without asking who owned the land. But the ranch would no longer be measured by distance. It would be measured by memory. Caleb Whitmore stood on the porch one late evening as the sun lowered itself behind the western ridge, painting the sky in long strokes of amber and soft red. Samuel, taller now and steady in his stride, was finishing the evening check along the southern pasture, his silhouette clear against the horizon. The boy no longer followed. He led. The fence lines held firm, every post straight, every board secured with hands that had grown from small and uncertain to strong and sure. Alara stepped beside Caleb, her presence as constant as the land itself. The garden behind the house was full, the cottonwoods near the creek casting long shadows nearly half a mile from the barn. Nothing about the scene demanded applause. Nothing called for recognition. It simply existed, solid and unshaken. Caleb watched Samuel close the gate with a careful motion, the same way he had been taught. No rush. No wasted effort. The silver pendant still rested against his chest, no longer questioned, no longer explained. It had become part of the story of the ranch, like the north fence or the old bay mare. Samuel approached the porch and removed his hat, wiping dust from his brow. "The herd is settled," he said. Caleb nodded once. "Good." The exchange was simple, but beneath it lay years of choice. Years of staying when leaving would have been easier. Samuel glanced across the open pasture and then back at the house. "I used to think the horizon was calling us," he said quietly. Caleb followed his gaze to where the sky met the land in a thin, unwavering line. "It still does," Caleb answered. "It just does not call us away." The prairie wind rose gently, moving through the tall grass, brushing against the boards of the house that had once stood empty. Now they held laughter, shared meals, names spoken without doubt. Caleb looked at his son, at the strength in his shoulders and the calm in his eyes, and felt no need to explain the past anymore. The truth had already rooted itself. Alara rested her hand lightly over Caleb's, and for a long moment the three of them stood together beneath the wide, open sky. No town watching, no riders waiting at the gate, just land and family and the quiet understanding that belonging is not granted by permission or proven by resemblance alone. It is chosen, protected, and lived each day. As the sun disappeared completely and the first stars began to show, Caleb Whitmore realized that the ranch would outlast him. The fences would need mending again. The grass would fade and return. But the choice to stay, the promise carried in a silver pendant, and the name written firm and clear would remain long after the wind had erased their footprints from the dust. And out here, that was enough.